In this video, we continue our discussion of decolonisation and independence, which covers 2 weeks. In this next section, we'll be thinking about these 3 main issues. What happened after the 1965 Constitutional Conference? What happened on Independence Day on the 10th of October 1970? And what happened after 1970? In the previous video, we discussed who was there at the 1965 Constitutional Conference, a point in time where Italki leaders began to realise that they needed to seriously consider what would change and the pace of that change as England pushed for decolonisation. Some of the key issues for contention at this event were the pace of change, how quickly Fiji would become independent, and also the decision on whether new elections would use a communal roll with specific reserved seats for different ethnic groups, or a common roll, a position which was favoured by the Indo-Fijians, represented by A.D. Patel, who stressed the importance of unreserved seats for all people, regardless of their ethnicity. As a result of this conference, a new constitution was proclaimed in 1966, and it ended the nomination of unofficial members. These were members who were appointed by the governor. It expanded voting to Chinese, Ratumans, and Pacific Islanders. It created a public service commission, which was designed to help promote and train people within Fiji to take over administrative roles previously done by British colonial officials. So preparing Fiji to administratively be ready for taking over government. And crucially, it expanded the Legislative Council to 36 members. Here we see Fijians having the largest share of votes, of seats in this Legislative Council. But also we see a concession. Not only are there communal seats reserved for different racial groups, but there are also cross-voting seats. Cross-voting seats were essentially a limited concession to the principle of a common roll. And these were seats that were national seats that could be contested or voted by anyone regardless of their race. And we still have 2 seats nominated by the Great Council of Chiefs. So essentially we see, as an outcome of this conference, a compromise between the different ideas. As a result, there was an election. We see here some interesting photos taken by Robert Norton, a historian who was here in Fiji at the time, of these political parties and their rallies in preparation for the next set of elections. Here's A.D. Patel speaking at an election rally in Suva. Here's an Indian polling station outside what's now known today as the Olympic Pool in Suva. Then it was known as the Suva Sea Baths. So just to sort of impart the importance of segregation at this time, not only were people segregated in the workplace and in the Legislative Council, even the baths, the public swimming areas where they swam were segregated, and the polling stations were segregated. So there were certain polling stations for certain races. But we're starting to see slowly unwinding some of these policies implemented by the British. The 1966 election proceeded according to expectations, but there were still some underlying tensions between those who wanted to ensure Italki paramountcy and those whose ultimate goal was a common roll or parity between all peoples. One of the leaders of the Great Council of Chiefs, Ratu Penaia Nganilau, in 1967 said there was a, quote, fundamental, unavoidable conflict of ideas between the traditional and modern principles of government, end quote. This tension came to a head in 1968 when there was a by-election. A by-election refers to when a seat becomes vacant and there is a small election held to replace that vacant seat. In this particular case, the 1968 by-election was sparked when a number of the Federation Party candidates in the Legislative Council walked out This was over some historic issues of contention regarding the service of Indians in World War II and the 1960 cane strike. At the time, the by-election was viewed as a referendum on A.D. Patel's leadership. And in the subsequent election results, there were surprising results. In the by-election, all of the 9 Federation candidates who had vacated their seats actually retained their seats with increased majorities. Mara and the Alliance Party were shocked and felt betrayed. This was a wake-up call to Fijian leaders who realised that they could not drag their feet on constitutional reform. And when Governor Derek Jakaway left Fiji in 1968, this same year, he actually advised London that they needed to eliminate the communal role and replace it with cross-voting. So we see here both an awareness amongst the Fijian leaders that there was public support for changing the communal system, and also even the governor of Fiji at the time writing back to London and also saying that they needed to eliminate the communal role, that this was damaging relations between people in Fiji. You can read excerpts of this in the reading on Moodle. The 1966 Constitution, he argued, had 2 major defects. He said it entrenched communalism and overrepresented the Europeans. Remember, the Europeans at this time represented only 1.4% of the population, but they held 25% of the elected seats. Separate racial representation could perhaps work as a transitional measure, but most of the countries in which it was adopted at one time or another have had a depressing record of intercommunal violence, said Jakaway. So it's really interesting here that Jakaway is almost foreshadowing the potential for interethnic violence as a result of these unresolved tensions over the electoral system. There are some interesting histories about this event. It's rather complex. Robert Norton and James Anthony have articles in the Journal of Pacific History that talk about this crisis. There are reports that it almost came close to sort of a violent climax as a result. When Jakaway left, he was succeeded by Sir Robert Foster, and although violence was avoided, there was renewed efforts to bring all members to the table for a new constitutional conference in 1969 to have one more go at revising the constitution. In August that year, representatives of the Alliance and Federation Party began informal confidential talks in London. In 1969, Patel said that Fiji was ready for immediate independence on the basis of universal adult franchise with the Commonwealth. Ratumara argued Fiji was ready for immediate and full internal self-government, but without a common role, and with a firm and guaranteed protection of basic Fijian rights. So essentially both parties hadn't changed in their demands. However, what did occur was the death of Patel quite suddenly and unexpectedly after the first meeting. And when Patel died, he was succeeded by Sadiq Koya, who was also a lawyer by training. But Koya was more conciliatory and pragmatic in his views. Between August 1969 and March 1970, the confidential meetings identified many areas of agreements: on the protection of Fijian interests in the upper house, on moving straight to Dominion status without going through an interim period of internal self-government, and on citizenship. What they ended up agreeing to was a bicameral legislature with upper house and lower house. So this is a little different to what Fiji Parliament looks like today, but it may resemble other parliaments in the world that have inherited a British system. Essentially 2 houses, a lower house with elected representatives, and an upper house with nominees. In the lower house there would be 52 seats, 22 each for Fijians and Indo-Fijians, and 8 for general electors. This referred to all the other races within Fiji. Of those 22 seats, 12 were contested based on communal votes, and the remaining 10 would be open to national seats. So we still see here an agreement to hold on to an aspect of the communal voting. So there were more concessions to the Indo-Fijian side, but communal votes were still preserved. In the upper house, there were 22 seats. The upper house being a body that would approve or finalise bills and laws in Parliament. In this upper house, 8 of the seats were nominated by the Great Council of Chiefs, so reinforcing that idea of Fijian paramountcy. 7 for nominees of the Prime Minister, 6 for nominees of the opposition, and interestingly 1 seat specifically for Rotuma. And it was agreed that Fiji would go straight into independence without holding an election. This last point was important. It was an outcome that the Fijian leaders and England had long wanted. Fijian leaders, Italke leaders, would be in control when taking Fiji into independence. There was still that concern at the time that Indo-Fijians, being the majority of the population, would potentially have the possibility of taking over the leadership of the country. And that was something that Sadiq Koya, the man pictured in the left, was more willing than A.D. Patel to compromise on, and it saw Ratumara as Fiji's first Prime Minister, taking Fiji into its era of independence. So we can see here just a graphic depiction of how the new Parliament of Fiji in 1970 would be shared amongst the different groups, with crucially that communal element still preserved and Fijian paramountcy still preserved as well. So those, just taking you back to Governor Jakaway's note to England in 1968, he did warn that countries which had separate racial representation have a, quote, depressing record of intercommunal violence. So even though Jakaway had warned the UK that there's potential for these tensions to erupt, that tension and that issue was not resolved in Fiji's constitution. And that would have important ramifications for the future of Fiji. Robert Norton goes into great detail on this point, looking at documents from the British archives to explain or to highlight the complexities between diverse views amongst the indigenous Fijian chiefly group, as well as diverse views within the UK. There was pressure on the UK to decolonise and perhaps to push forward with an agenda, knowing full well that some of the issues had been unresolved. So I think if you want to read more about that, Robert Norton's work in Journal of Pacific History and online is really useful.